Greetings once again, YouTube Pipe community. Peter Piper, the True Light, coming to you very early at 0025 hours on a Wednesday morning. So I've been reading Atlas Shrugged for the past two videos, this being the third, and I'm going to continue to read for those of you who enjoy hearing a good story. My last video ended abruptly. I think apparently my cell phone reached its limit on the amount of time that it will record a video, which was in excess of half an hour. So let me continue, and I'll back up a bit to where I was and continue reading forward. Once again, this is Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. And I need my glasses. In the dilapidated office of Winston Station, he confronted a sleepy man with slack-worn features and frightened young boy who sat at the operator's desk. They listened in silent stupor to a stream of profanity such as they had never heard from any station gang. "And it's not my problem how you get the train through the tunnel. That's for you to figure out," Chalmers concluded. "But if you don't get me an engine and don't start that train, you can kiss goodbye your jobs, your work permits, and this whole goddamn railroad." The station agent had never heard of Kip Chalmers and did not know the nature of his position. But he knew that this was the day when unknown men in unidentified positions held unlimited power, the power of life or death. "It's not up to us, Mr. Chalmers," he said pleadingly. "We don't issue orders out here. The order came from Silver Springs. Suppose you telephone Mr. Mitchum and—" "Who's Mr. Mitchum?" "He's the division superintendent of Silver Springs. Suppose you send him a message to—" "I should bother with a division superintendent? I'll send a message to Jim Taggart. That's what I'm going to do." Before the station agent had time to recover, Chalmers whirled to the boy, ordering, "You! Take this down and send it at once." It was a message which a month ago the station agent would not have accepted from any passenger. The rules forbade it, but it was not certain about any rules any longer. "Mr. James Taggart, New York City. Am held up on the Comet at Winston, Colorado, by the incompetence of your men who refuse to give me an engine. Have meeting in San Francisco in the evening of top-level national importance. If you don't move my train at once, I'll let you guess the consequences. Kip Chalmers." After the boy had transmitted the words onto the wires that stretched from pole to pole across a continent as guardians of the Taggart track, after Kip Chalmers had returned to his car to wait for an answer, the station agent telephoned Dave Mitchum, who was his friend, and read to him the text of the message. He heard Mitchum groan in answer. "I thought I'd tell you, Dave. I never heard of the guy before, but maybe he's somebody important." "I don't know," moaned Mitchum. "Kip Chalmers. You see his name in the newspapers all the time, right in with all the top-level boys. I don't know what he is, but if he's from Washington, we can't take any chances. Oh, Christ, what are we going to do?" We can't take any chances, thought the Taggart operator in New York, and transmitted the message by telephone to James Taggart's home. It was close to 6 a.m. in New York, and James Taggart was awakened out of the fitful sleep of a restless night. He listened to the telephone, his face sagging. He felt the same fear as the station agent of Winston, and for the same reason. He called the home of Clifton Loki. All the rage he could not pour upon Kip Chalmers was poured over the telephone right upon Clifton Loki. Do something, screamed Taggart. I don't care what you do, it's your job, not mine. But see to it that the train gets through. What in hell is going on? I never heard of the comet being held up. Is that how you run your department? It's a fine thing when important passengers have to start sending messages to me. At least when my sister ran the place, I wasn't awakened in the middle of the night over every spike that broke in Iowa, Colorado, I mean. I'm so sorry, Jim, said Clifton Loki smoothly, in a tone that balanced apology, reassurance, and the right degree of patronizing confidence. It's just a misunderstanding. It's somebody's stupid mistake. Don't worry, I'll take care of it. I was, as a matter of fact, in bed, but I'll attend to it at once. Clifton Loki was not in bed. He had just returned from a round of nightclubs in the company of a young lady. He asked her to wait and hurried to the offices of Taggart Transcontinental. None of the night staff who saw him there could say why he chose to appear in person, but neither could they say that he had been unnecessarily. He rushed in and out of several offices, was seen by many people, and gave an impression of great activity. The only physical result of it was an order that went over the wires to Dave Mitchum, superintendent of the Colorado Division. Give an engine to Mr. Chalmers at once, send the comet through safely and without necessary delay. If you're unable to perform your duties, I shall hold you responsible before the Unification Board. Clifton Loki. Then, calling his girlfriend to join him, Clifton Loki drove to a country roadhouse to make certain that no one would be able to find him in the next few hours. The dispatcher at Silver Springs was baffled by the order that he handed to Dave Mitchum, but Dave Mitchum understood. He knew that no railroad order would ever speak in such terms as giving an engine to a passenger. He knew that the thing was a showpiece. He guessed what sort of show was being staged, and he felt a cold sweat at the realization of who was being framed as the goat of the show. What's the matter, Dave? Asked the trainmaster. Mitchum did not answer. He seized the telephone, his hands shaking as he begged for a connection to the Taggart operator in New York. He looked like an animal in a trap. He begged the New York operator to get him Mr. Clifton Loki's home. The operator tried. There was no answer. He begged the operator to keep trying and try every number he could think of where Mr. Loki might be found. The operator promised and Mitchum hung up. But he knew it was useless to wait or to speak to anyone in Mr. Loki's department. What's the matter, Dave? Mitchum handed him the order and saw by the look on the trainmaster's face that the trap was as bad as he had suspected. He called the region headquarters of Taggart Transcontinental at Omaha, Nebraska, and begged to speak to the general manager of the region. There was a brief silence on the wire. Then the voice of the Omaha operator told him that the general manager had resigned and vanished 3 days ago. Over a little trouble with Mr. Loki, the voice added. He asked to speak to the assistant general manager in charge of his particular district, but the assistant was out of town for the week and could not be reached. Get me somebody else, Mitchum screamed. Anybody of any district. For Christ's sake, get me somebody who'll tell me what to do. The man who came on the wire was the assistant general manager of the Iowa-Minnesota district. What? He interrupted as Mitchum's first words. At Winston, Colorado? Why in hell are you calling me? No, don't tell me what happened. I don't want to know it. No, I said, no. You're not going to frame me into having to explain afterwards why I did or didn't do anything about whatever it is. It's not my problem. Speak to some region executive. Don't pick on me. What do I have to do with Colorado? Oh, hell, I don't know. Get the chief engineer. Speak to him. The chief engineer of the central region answered impatiently. Yes? What? What is it? And Mitchum rushed desperately to explain. When the chief engineer heard that there was no diesel, he snapped, Then hold the train, of course. When he heard about Mr. Chalmers, he said, his voice suddenly subdued, Kip Chalmers. Of Washington? Well, I don't know. That would be a matter for Mr. Loki to decide. When Mitchum said, Mr. Loki ordered me to arrange it, but... The chief engineer snapped in great relief. Then do exactly as Mr. Loki says, and hung up. Dave Mitchum replaced the telephone receiver cautiously. He did not scream any longer. Instead, he tiptoed to a chair, almost as if he were sneaking. He sat looking at Mr. Loki's order for a long time. Then he snatched a glance about the room. The dispatcher was busy at his telephone. The train master and the road foreman were there, but they pretended that they were not waiting. He wished Bill Brent, the chief dispatcher, would go home. Bill Brent stood in a corner watching him. Brent was a short, thin man with broad shoulders. He was 40, but looked younger. He had the pale face of an office worker and the hard, lean features of a cowboy. He was the best dispatcher on the system. Mitchum rose abruptly and walked upstairs to his office, clutching Loki's order in his hand. Dave Mitchum was not good at understanding problems of engineering and transportation, but he understood men like Clifton Loki. He understood the kind of game the New York executives were playing and what they were now doing to him. The order did not tell him to give Mr. Chalmers a coal-burning engine, just an engine. If the time came to answer questions, wouldn't Mr. Loki gasp in shocked indignation that he had expected a division superintendent to know that only a diesel engine could be meant in that order? The order stated that he was to send the comet through safely. Wasn't a division superintendent expected to know what was safe and without unnecessary delay? What's an unnecessary delay and without unnecessary delay? What was unnecessary delay? If the possibility of a major disaster was involved, wouldn't a delay of a week or a month be considered necessary? The New York executives did not care, thought Mitchum. They did not care whether Mr. Chalmers reached his meeting on time or whether an unprecedented catastrophe struck their rails. They cared only about making sure that they would not be blamed for either. If he held the train, they would make him the scapegoat to appease the anger of Mr. Chalmers. If he sent the train through and it did not reach the western portal of the tunnel, they would put the blame on his incompetence. They would claim that he had acted against their orders in either case. What would be what would he be able to prove? To whom? One could prove nothing to a tribunal that had no stated policy, no defined procedure, no rules of evidence, no binding principles, a tribunal such as the Unification Board that pronounced men guilty or innocent as it saw fit, with no standard of guilt or innocence. Dave Mitchum knew nothing about the philosophy of law, but he knew that when a court is not bound by any rules, it's not bound by any facts, and then a hearing is not an issue of justice, but an issue of men, and your fate depends not on what you have or what's not done, but on whom you do not know. He asked himself what chance he would have at such a hearing against Mr. James Taggart, Mr. Clifton Loki, Mr. Kip Chalmers, and their powerful friends. Dave Mitchum had spent his life slipping around the necessity of ever making a decision. He had done it by waiting to be told and never being certain of anything. All that he now allowed into his brain was a long, indignant whine against injustice. Fate, he thought, had singled him out for an unfair account of bad luck. He was being framed by his superiors on the only good job he had ever held. He had never been taught to understand that the manner in which he obtained his job and the frame-up were inextricable parts of a single whole. As he looked at Loki's order, he thought that he could not hold the comet. As he looked at Loki's order, he thought that he could hold the comet, attach Mr. Chalmers' car to an engine, and send it into the tunnel alone. But he shook his head before the thought was fully formed. He knew that this would force Mr. Chalmers to recognize the nature of the risk. Mr. Chalmers would refuse. He would continue to demand a safe and non-existent engine. And more, this could mean that he, Mitchum, would have to assume responsibility, admit full knowledge of the danger, stand in open and identify the exact nature of the situation, the one act which the policy of his superiors was based on evading, the one key to their game. Dave Mitchum was not the man to rebel against his background or to question the moral code of those in charge. The choice he made was not to challenge, but to follow the policy of his superiors. Bill Brent could have beaten him in any contest of technology, but here was an endeavor at which he could beat Bill Brent without effort. There had once been a society where men needed the particular talents of Bill Brent if they wished to survive. What they needed now was the talent of Dave Mitchum. Dave Mitchum sat down at his secretary's typewriter and, by means of 2 fingers, carefully typed out an order to the train master and another to the road foreman. The first instructed the train master to summon a locomotive crew at once, for the purpose described only as an emergency. The second instructed the road foreman to send the best engine available to Winston to stand by for emergency assistance. He put carbon copies of the orders into his own pocket, then opened the door, yelled for the night dispatcher to come up, and handed him the 2 orders for the 2 men downstairs. The night dispatcher was a conscientious young boy who trusted his superiors and knew that discipline was the first rule of the railroad business. He was astonished that Mitchum should wish to send written orders down one flight of stairs, but he asked no questions. Mitchum waited nervously. After a while, he saw the figure of the road foreman walking across the yards toward the roundhouse. He felt relieved. The two men had not come up to confront him in person. They had understood, and they would play the game as he was playing it. The road foreman walked across the yards, looking down at the ground. He was thinking of his wife, his two children, and the house which he had spent a lifetime to own. He knew what his superiors were doing, and he wondered whether he should refuse to obey them. He had never been afraid of losing his job. With the confidence of a competent man, he had known that if he quarreled with one employer, he would always be able to find another. Now he was afraid. He had no right to quit or seek a job. If he felt an employer, he would be delivered. If he defied an employer, he would be delivered into the unanswerable power of a single board. And if the board ruled against him, it would mean being sentenced to the slow death of starvation. It would mean being barred from any employment. He knew that the board would rule against him. He knew that the key to the dark, capricious mystery of the board's contradictory decisions was the secret power of pull. What chance would he have against Mr. Chalmers? There had been a time when the self-interest of his employers had demanded that he exercise his utmost ability. Now, ability was not wanted any longer. There had been a time when he had been required to do his best and rewarded accordingly. Now, he could expect nothing but punishment if he tried to follow his conscience. There had been a time when he had been expected to think. Now, they did not want him to think, only to obey. They did not want him to have a conscience any longer. Then why should he raise his voice? For whose sake? He thought of the passengers, the 300 passengers aboard the Comet. He thought of his children. He had a son in high school and a daughter 19, of whom he was fiercely, painfully proud, because she was recognized as the most beautiful girl in town. He asked himself whether he could deliver his children to the fate of the children of the unemployed, as he had seen them in the blighted areas, in the settlements around closed factories, and along the tracks of discontinued railroads. He saw in astonished horror that the choice which he now had to make was between the lives of his children and the lives of the passengers on the Comet. A conflict of this kind had never been possible before. It was by protecting the safety of the passengers that he had earned his security of his children, and he served one by serving the other. There had been no clash of interests, no call of victims. Now he wanted to save the passengers. If he wanted to save the passengers, he had to do it at the price of his children. He remembered dimly the sermons he heard about the beauty of self-immolation, about the virtue of sacrificing to others that which was one's dearest. He knew nothing about philosophy of ethics, but he knew suddenly, not in words, but in the form of a dark, angry, savage pain, that this was virtue. Then he wanted no part of it. I'll end the reading here, coming up on 25 minutes. We'll continue perhaps tomorrow, and this will be the last reading for this evening. Once again, keep Stonehenge minstrel in your thoughts and prayers. Take care, and I'll see you tomorrow. Good night, folks.